Case 1. Melissa Calusinski. The interrogation had been going on for 9 hours. Melissa Calusinski, a 22-year-old teacher's assistant at the Mini-Subi Daycare Center in Lincolnshire, Illinois, had denied any wrongdoing 70 times. She had told detectives repeatedly that she did not know what had happened to 16-month-old Benjamin Kingen, that she had found him unresponsive in his bouncy chair, that she had done nothing to hurt him. But the detectives did not believe her. They kept pressing. They told her they knew she had done something. They described scenarios. They suggested that she had thrown the child to the floor in frustration. And then, after 9 hours, Melissa Calusinski answered quote _0 _ when Detective George Valenko asked if she had thrown Benjamin down. She demonstrated how she had done it. Within 24 hours, she recanted. She said the confession was false, that she had been terrified, that she thought if she told them what they wanted to hear, they would let her go home. It was too late. She was charged with first-degree murder. In November 2011, a jury convicted her and sentenced her to 31 years in prison. Melissa Calusinski has maintained her innocence for more than 16 years. The case has become one of the most controversial wrongful conviction claims in Illinois, plagued by allegations of a coerced confession, missing X-rays, and evidence manipulation. Melissa Calusinski was born in 1986 and grew up in Carpentersville, Illinois. Her family described her as kind-hearted, someone who would bend over backwards for anybody. But Melissa was different in ways that made her vulnerable. She had difficulty expressing herself and understanding others. Her sister Crystal said Melissa was teased at school. Melissa's IQ was measured at 74. Despite these challenges, Melissa found her calling. She wanted to work with children. "Just hearing them little babies, it makes my day," she said. When an opportunity came up to work at the Mini-Subi Daycare Center with her sister Crystal, Melissa jumped at the chance to become a teacher's assistant. She was 22 years old. She had never been in trouble. Parents and co-workers described her as loving and patient. Children were fond of her, Crystal would later say. Benjamin Kingen was 16 months old. He had a twin sister, Emily, and 2 older siblings, all of whom attended the Mini-Subi Daycare Center in Lincolnshire, an affluent suburb of Chicago. His parents, Amy and Andy Kingen, were described by prosecutors as loving, private people who spent time with their children and held professional jobs. Ben was a healthy, happy toddler. Quote _4 Assistant State's Attorney Stephen Scheller would later say. On January 14th, 2009, Ben's parents dropped him and his siblings off at the daycare center, expecting a normal day. What happened that afternoon remains disputed. According to Melissa Calusinski, she was in a classroom with Ben and 7 other toddlers, including his twin sister, Emily. Ben was sitting in his bouncy chair, playing with his blanket. He started to fall asleep. When Melissa tried to wake him, calling his name, there was no response. She says she saw him crawl to the bouncy seat and then found him passed out on the floor. He was unresponsive and foaming at the mouth. Melissa's sister, Crystal, who also worked at the daycare, administered CPR. Ben was rushed to the hospital. He died a few hours later, before his parents could reach him. An autopsy determined that Ben had died from a skull fracture and brain bleeding caused by blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide. Melissa Calusinski was the last person alone with Benjamin Kingen before he lost consciousness. 2 days after Ben's death, on January 16th, 2009, Melissa Calusinski underwent 10 hours of questioning by investigators. She was 22 years old, had an IQ of 74, and was interrogated without her parents or a lawyer present. For 9 hours, she denied hurting Benjamin Kingen. She denied it 70 times. Detective Sean Curran and Detective George Falenko kept pressing her. They told her they knew she had done something. They described scenarios in which she had thrown the child to the floor. Finally, exhausted and terrified, Melissa changed her story. Curran suggested. Falenko asked. Melissa answered. She demonstrated the action with a doll, showing how she had allegedly thrown Ben to the ground. She says now that she thought if she told them what they wanted to hear, they would let her go home. Quote, 10 quote, she later said. Quote, 11. Quote, within 24 hours. She recanted, but she had already been arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place in November 2011 in Lake County, Illinois. Judge Daniel Shaines presided. Prosecutors Matt DeMartini and Stephen Scheller argued that Melissa had thrown the 22-pound toddler to the floor so violently that he suffered fatal brain trauma when his head hit the tile floor. They presented the videotaped confession in which Melissa admitted to throwing Ben down. They argued that Ben had been a healthy, happy toddler before Melissa killed him, not a child with pre-existing injuries. The confession, they said, was voluntary and truthful. Defense attorney Paul DeLuca argued that Melissa had never harmed the child and that the confession had been coerced. He presented two pathologists who testified that Benjamin had prior, undiagnosed brain bleeding that could have been abruptly aggravated by even a minor head injury. The defense pointed to an injury Ben had sustained 3 months before his death, before Melissa even started working at the daycare. Another worker had been with Ben when he got a lump on his head. DeLuca argued that Ben had a habit of throwing himself back and hitting his head during temper tantrums, and that this habit had exacerbated the old injury and contributed to his death. Prosecutor Kristen Bishop dismissed the defense's claims, telling jurors that Ben was a healthy, happy toddler before he died, not a ticking time bomb. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty. Melissa Calusinski was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated battery. On February 23, 2012, Judge Daniel Shaines sentenced Melissa Calusinski to 31 years in prison. She faced a possible life sentence, but the judge opted for the shorter term. In the courtroom, Amy Kingan addressed the court, her husband Andy sitting beside her, holding her hand. "There's no way to comprehend what Melissa has done to us," she said. "We will never recover from what she did. He had so much life ahead of him, and she took that away from him and us. We wish so badly we could hold him in our arms one last time." Melissa maintained that she was innocent. Her attorneys immediately began filing appeals. The case did not end with the conviction. In 2012, Dr. Thomas Rudd, the newly elected Lake County coroner, agreed to review the autopsy evidence at the urging of Melissa's attorney. In slides of Benjamin's brain, Rudd identified what he said was evidence of an old injury that the original pathologist had missed. Rudd and another pathologist he consulted believed the old injury had been exacerbated by Ben's head-banging habit. Then, in 2014, it was discovered that X-rays taken during Ben's autopsy had never been provided to the defense. The X-rays, according to Rudd and defense experts, showed the chronic head injury that supported Melissa's innocence. The revelation that these X-rays had been withheld became the centerpiece of Melissa's appeals. Attorney Kathleen Zellner, who specializes in wrongful conviction cases, took over Melissa's defense and argued that prosecutors had manipulated evidence and that the confession had been coerced. Zellner pointed out that the video of Melissa demonstrating the throw with a doll did not even correlate with the prosecution's theory of how the injury occurred. Despite these arguments, Melissa's appeals were denied by the courts. In April 2024, Zellner filed a clemency petition with Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, asking him to exonerate Melissa or release her for time served. A clemency hearing was held in July 2024. Lake County State's Attorney Eric Reinhart opposed the petition, stating that his office had maintained a conviction integrity unit and was open to new evidence, but that no such evidence had been presented. Ben Kingan's parents attended the hearing and spoke in opposition to Melissa's release, saying they remained convinced of her guilt. The Illinois Prisoner Review Board made a confidential recommendation to the governor. As of early 2026, Governor Pritzker has not acted. Melissa Calusinski is 39 years old. She is incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Illinois, where she has served 16 years of her 31-year sentence. She will not be eligible for parole until 2039. She continues to maintain that she is innocent, that the confession was coerced, and that she did not harm Benjamin Kingan. "This is not where I belong," she has said. "I'm going to continue to fight no matter what, because I did not do this." The case remains one of the most divisive in Illinois criminal justice history. Some believe Melissa Calusinski is a wrongfully convicted woman who was pressured into a false confession and denied a fair trial. Others believe the jury heard all the relevant evidence and made the correct decision. Benjamin Kingan's family has never wavered in their conviction that Melissa is guilty. The missing X-rays, the allegations of coercion, and the conflicting medical opinions have created a controversy that has lasted more than 16 years. Whether Melissa Calusinski will ever be released remains to be seen. Case 2. Naomi Freeman, an unlicensed daycare provider in Bakersfield, California, was caring for a 10-month-old infant in 2013 when the baby would not stop crying. Naomi Freeman's frustration mounted with each wail. What happened next was an act of violence so extreme that it killed the child. Freeman later admitted to investigators that she had dropped or slammed the infant. The language was vague, but the result was not. Mackenzie Hernandez died from the injuries Freeman inflicted. Freeman was convicted of second-degree murder and assault on a child, resulting in death. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The case highlighted the dangers of unlicensed daycare providers operating without oversight, training, or supervision. Naomi Freeman operated an unlicensed daycare in Bakersfield. She had no formal training in childcare and no credentials. She operated outside the regulatory system, which meant that parents who left their children with her had no assurance that she had been vetted, that her home had been inspected, or that she had any understanding of how to care for infants. The absence of oversight created the conditions for tragedy. Mackenzie Hernandez was 10 months old. She had no ability to protect herself, no way to communicate her needs except through crying. On the day she died, she was in Naomi Freeman's care. She cried as infants do. Freeman could not make her stop. Mackenzie would not stop crying. Freeman became frustrated. What exactly Freeman did to the child is described in her own words as dropping or slamming the infant. The vague language suggests either uncertainty about what to call the act or an attempt to minimize it. But investigators and prosecutors determined that Freeman had used lethal force against a 10-month-old baby. The injuries Mackenzie sustained were fatal. She died as a result of the trauma Freeman inflicted. There was no accident, no fall, no medical emergency that could explain the child's death. Freeman admitted that she had caused it. The investigation into Mackenzie's death led quickly to Freeman. Her admission that she had dropped or slammed the child provided the evidence prosecutors needed. The case was straightforward in the sense that there was no dispute about who had caused the child's death. Freeman had been alone with Mackenzie when the injuries occurred, and she had confessed to causing them. The question was not whether Freeman was responsible, but what charge she would face and what sentence she would receive. Freeman was charged with second-degree murder and assault on a child, resulting in death. The trial focused on the nature of her actions and the level of culpability. Prosecutors argued that Freeman's frustration had led her to commit an act of violence against a helpless infant. The defense offered no credible alternative explanation. Freeman had admitted to dropping or slamming the child. The evidence supported the conclusion that she had caused Mackenzie's death through an intentional act of force. The jury convicted Freeman of second-degree murder and assault on a child resulting in death. Freeman was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime and the fact that the victim was a 10-month-old infant who had no ability to defend herself. The judge made clear that Freeman's actions had been inexcusable and that her lack of training and frustration were not mitigating factors. Mackenzie Hernandez had been placed in Freeman's care, and Freeman had killed her. Naomi Freeman serves a sentence of 25 years to life in a California prison. Mackenzie Hernandez was 10 months old when she died. She cried because that is what infants do. Freeman, an unlicensed daycare provider with no training and no supervision, responded with lethal violence. The case is a stark reminder of the risks posed by unlicensed childcare providers who operate outside the regulatory system. Parents who left their children with Freeman had no way of knowing that she lacked the skills, temperament, and oversight necessary to care for infants safely. The result was the death of a child who should have been protected. Case 3. Deborah J. Schulz. A 4-month-old infant became unresponsive in June 2004 while in the care of a licensed home daycare provider in Greendale, Wisconsin. Doctors at the hospital found the classic medical quote, _24 of symptoms associated with shaken baby syndrome: retinal hemorrhaging, brain swelling, and subdural hematoma. Deborah J. Schultz initially claimed that Benjamin Schammer had fallen off a couch. Medical experts testified that the injuries Benjamin sustained required violent force, the kind of force that could not result from a fall off a couch. Schultz was convicted of first-degree reckless homicide and sentenced to 10 years in prison, followed by 10 years of extended supervision. The case became another entry in the long and controversial history of shaken baby syndrome prosecutions, in which medical evidence is often the primary basis for conviction, and in which the accused frequently maintain that the injuries were accidental. Deborah J. Schultz had obtained the necessary state licensure to operate a daycare out of her home, which required passing background checks and meeting the minimum regulatory requirements. She was caring for Benjamin Schammer, a 4-month-old infant, when the events that led to his death occurred. Benjamin Schammer was 4 months old. He was an infant in the care of a licensed daycare provider, and his parents had entrusted Schultz to keep him safe. He was too young to sit up on his own, too young to defend himself, and incapable of protecting himself from harm. Benjamin Schammer became unresponsive while in Deborah Schultz's care. Schultz called for emergency help, and the baby was rushed to the hospital. Doctors examined him and found retinal hemorrhaging, brain swelling, and subdural hematoma, the 3 symptoms that medical professionals refer to as the triad of shaken baby syndrome. The presence of all 3 symptoms is considered strong evidence of abusive head trauma caused by violent shaking. When investigators questioned Schultz, she claimed that Benjamin had fallen off a couch. The fall, she suggested, had caused the injuries. Medical experts were brought in to evaluate the claim. They testified that the severity of Benjamin's injuries could not have resulted from a fall off a couch. The injuries required violent force, the kind of force that occurs when an infant is shaken with significant strength. The experts concluded that Benjamin had been a victim of shaken baby syndrome. Prosecutors built their case on medical testimony. There were no witnesses to what had happened in Schultz's home. There was no video footage, no physical evidence beyond the injuries to Benjamin's body. The medical experts said that the triad of symptoms could only have been caused by violent shaking. The defense argued that Schultz had not harmed the child and that the injuries could have resulted from the fall she described. But the medical testimony was persuasive. the jury convicted Schultz of first-degree reckless homicide. Deborah J. Schultz was sentenced to 10 years in prison, followed by 10 years of extended supervision. The sentence reflected the jury's conclusion that she had caused Benjamin Schammer's death through reckless conduct. Schultz maintained that she had not shaken the baby and that the injuries had been accidental. But the medical evidence and the jury's verdict told a different story. The conviction of Deborah Schultz is part of a larger and increasingly controversial category of cases involving shaken baby syndrome. In recent years, the medical consensus that once supported SBS prosecutions has been challenged by new research and by experts who argue that the triad of symptoms can be caused by factors other than violent shaking. Some convictions have been overturned, others have been upheld. The debate continues. In Schultz's case, the jury heard the medical evidence and concluded that she had caused Benjamin's death. Deborah J. Schultz has completed her sentence. Benjamin Schammer was 4 months old when he died. His parents placed him in the care of a licensed daycare provider, believing he would be safe. The medical evidence suggested that he was not. Case 4. Michelle Holford. The sign-in sheet at Katie's Kids Daycare Center in Delray Beach, Florida, had been forged. Staff had altered the document to make it appear that 2-year-old Haley Brockington had never arrived at the center on the day she died in 2010. The forgery was an attempt to cover up what had actually happened. The child had been left in a transport van for 6 hours in the Florida heat. Haley died in that van. Michelle Holford, the daycare owner, was convicted of third-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The case became a grim example of how negligence and attempted cover-ups can compound tragedy. Michelle Holford was the owner of Katie's Kids in Delray Beach. She operated the center and was responsible for the safety of the children in her care. She held a license to operate, which meant she had met the state's minimum requirements. She and her staff failed catastrophically in their duty to protect Haley Brockington, and after the child's death, they attempted to conceal their negligence. Haley Brockington was 2 years old. She was a toddler who attended Katie's Kids Daycare Center. Her parents entrusted the center to care for her during the day while they worked. On the day she died, Haley was placed in a transport van to be taken to the daycare center. She never made it inside. Michelle Holford and an employee were responsible for transporting children to Katie's Kids in a daycare van. Haley Brockington was one of the children in the van that day. At some point, the adults responsible for the children failed to ensure that all of them had been removed from the vehicle. Haley was left inside the van. The doors were closed. The windows were up. The van was parked in the Florida heat. Haley remained in the van for 6 hours. In Florida, even on a moderately warm day, the temperature inside a closed vehicle can climb to deadly levels within minutes. After 6 hours, Haley Brockington was dead. When her body was discovered, staff at Katie's Kids knew that they had made a catastrophic error. Rather than immediately reporting what had happened, they attempted to cover it up. The cover-up involved forging the sign-in sheet that documented which children had arrived at the daycare center each day. Staff altered the sheet to make it appear that Haley had never arrived at Katie's Kids on the day she died. The forgery was an attempt to shift responsibility and obscure the fact that Haley had been left in the van by employees of the center. The deception did not work. Investigators examining the circumstances of Haley's death discovered the forged sign-in sheet and determined that staff had attempted to conceal their negligence. The evidence pointed clearly to Michelle Holford and her employee as responsible for both Haley's death and the cover-up. Michelle Holford was charged with third-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter. The trial focused on the negligence that had led to Haley being left in the van and the attempted cover-up that followed. Prosecutors argued that Holford and her staff had shown a reckless disregard for Haley's safety. and that their attempt to forge the sign-in sheet demonstrated a consciousness of guilt. The defense presented no effective counterargument. The evidence was clear. Haley had been left in the van. She had died as a result, and staff had attempted to conceal what had happened. The jury convicted Michelle Holford of third-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter. Michelle Holford was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentence reflected the severity of the negligence and the aggravating factor of the cover-up. Haley Brockington had been left to die in a van, and rather than take responsibility, the staff at Katie's Kids had tried to make it appear that she had never been there. Michelle Holford serves 20 years in a Florida prison. Haley Brockington was 2 years old when she was left in a van in the Florida heat for 6 hours. Staff forged the sign-in sheet to cover up their negligence. But the deception failed. The attempted cover-up only deepened the tragedy. The case is a reminder that the harm caused by negligence can be compounded by dishonesty, and that attempts to conceal wrongdoing often only make the consequences worse. Case 5. Stacey J. Arthur. Stacey J. Arthur had what those who knew her described as a spotless record when she was caring for 18-month-old Zachary Curtis at her home daycare in Lemoyne, Maine, in 1996. The toddler suffered massive head trauma while in her care. The medical examiner determined that the injury was non-accidental and that the severity of the skull fracture proved it could not have resulted from a fall. Arthur maintained her innocence for years, claiming Zachary had fallen. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. The case became another example of the challenges prosecutors face in proving what happened when the only witnesses are a caregiver and a child too young to speak. Stacey J. Arthur operated a daycare out of her home in Lemoyne, a town in central Maine. She was responsible for the care of young children. On the day Zachary Curtis suffered his fatal injury, Arthur was the adult responsible for his safety. Zachary Curtis was 18 months old. He was a toddler in the care of Stacey Arthur. His parents had entrusted Arthur to keep him safe while they worked. Zachary was too young to explain what had happened to him, too young to defend himself, and incapable of protecting himself from violence. Zachary Curtis suffered massive head trauma while in Stacey Arthur's care. He was taken to the hospital, where doctors examined him and determined that he had sustained a severe skull fracture. The medical examiner reviewed the evidence and concluded that the injury was non-accidental. The severity of the fracture indicated that Zachary had been subjected to a significant amount of force, far more than could be explained by a fall or an accidental injury. When investigators questioned Arthur, she claimed that Zachary had fallen. She maintained that the injury was the result of an accident, but the medical evidence did not support her account. There were no witnesses to what had happened in Arthur's home. There was no video footage, no confession, no physical evidence beyond the injuries to Zachary's body. The medical examiner and other experts testified that the skull fracture Zachary sustained could only have been caused by a deliberate application of force. The defense argued that Arthur had not harmed the child and that the injury could have resulted from a fall. But the medical testimony was persuasive. The severity of the skull fracture was the key piece of evidence. The jury concluded that Arthur had caused Zachary's death. Stacey J. Arthur was convicted of murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial and for years afterward. She continued to insist that Zachary's injury had been accidental and that she had not harmed him. But the medical evidence and the jury's verdict told a different story. The skull fracture was too severe to have been accidental. The force required to cause such an injury was too great to be explained by a fall. Stacey J. Arthur is serving 28 years in a Maine prison. Zachary Curtis was 18 months old when he died. The skull fracture he sustained was too severe to have been accidental, according to medical examiners. Arthur has maintained her innocence for decades, but the evidence that convicted her remains. the severity of the injury, and the medical conclusion that it could not have been accidental. The case is another example of how medical testimony becomes the sole basis for conviction when the only witnesses are a caregiver and a child too young to speak. Case 6. Christina Renee Luffman. A 5-month-old infant suffered catastrophic brain injuries in 2019 while in the care of a daycare worker at Great Beginnings Childcare in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. The child did not survive. Christina Renee Luffman was charged with second-degree murder and felony child abuse. In 2021, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. The infant's name has been withheld in many accounts, often cited only as quote, _27, _. The case was one of the more recent in a long series of daycare worker prosecutions for fatal abuse of infants in their care. Christina Renee Luffman was employed at Great Beginnings Childcare and was responsible for the care of infants. She was entrusted with the care of a 5-month-old infant and failed catastrophically in that responsibility. The victim in this case was a 5-month-old infant whose name has been withheld in some sources and is often cited as quote, _28, _. The child's parents had placed the infant at Great Beginnings Childcare, believing the child would be safe. The 5-month-old infant in Christina Luffman's care suffered life-threatening injuries. The nature of the injuries indicated that they had been inflicted rather than accidental. The infant's brain was severely damaged. Medical examination determined that the injuries were consistent with abusive head trauma. The child did not survive. Investigators determined that Luffman had been responsible for the injuries and that she had caused the infant's death. The investigation into the infant's death led to Luffman. She was the daycare worker who had been caring for the child when the injuries occurred. The medical evidence indicated that the injuries were inflicted, not accidental. Prosecutors charged Luffman with second-degree murder and felony child abuse. The charges reflected the determination that Luffman had caused the infant's death through an intentional act of violence. Rather than proceed to trial, Christina Renee Luffman accepted a plea deal. In 2021, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The plea spared her the possibility of a longer sentence and avoided the need for a trial in which the details of the infant's injuries would have been presented to a jury. By pleading guilty, Luffman admitted that she had caused the infant's death. The court accepted the plea and moved to sentencing. Christina Renee Luffman was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime and the fact that the victim was a 5-month-old infant. Luffman did not contest the charges or present a defense. She accepted responsibility through her guilty plea. Christina Renee Luffman serves 12 to 15 years in a North Carolina prison. The 5-month-old infant she was entrusted to care for died from injuries she inflicted. By pleading guilty, Luffman admitted responsibility. The infant's parents placed their child in her care, and Luffman killed the child. The infant's name has been withheld in many accounts, but the facts of the case remain clear. A daycare worker caused the death of a 5-month-old child through an act of violence. Case 7. LaToya Louise Bell. LaToya Louise Bell claimed she had forgotten that 8-month-old Jakar Hayona, Huge's double, was in the car. The child, who was Bell's relative, had been left in a vehicle with the windows up in September 2015 in Augusta, Georgia, while Bell went inside her home to take a nap. By the time Bell realized what had happened, the infant was dead from the heat. Bell was convicted of second-degree murder and cruelty to children and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The case was another entry in the tragic and growing list of hot car deaths involving children left in vehicles by caregivers. LaToya Louise Bell was operating a residential childcare service in Augusta. She was providing daycare out of her home and was caring for multiple children, including Jessica Tata's double, who was her relative. The family connection likely created a level of trust from the child's parents. Belle failed catastrophically in her duty to ensure the safety of the children in her care. Jessica Tata's double was 8 months old. She was an infant who was both a client of Belle's daycare service and a relative. Her parents had entrusted Belle to care for her, likely believing that the family connection would ensure that Jessica Tata would be treated with extra care and attention. She was too young to open a car door, too young to call for help, and incapable of saving herself. LaToya Bell was responsible for transporting children as part of her residential childcare service. Jessica Tata's double was in a vehicle that Belle was operating. At some point, Belle went inside her home, leaving Jessica Tata in the vehicle. The windows were up, the car was not running. In Georgia, in September, the temperature inside a closed vehicle can climb rapidly to deadly levels. Belle later claimed that she had forgotten that Jessica Tata was in the car and that she had gone inside to take a nap. How long Jessica Tata remained in the vehicle is not precisely documented, but it was long enough for the heat to become fatal. By the time Belle realized what had happened, Jessica Tata was dead. The investigation into Jessica Tata's death focused on Belle's claim that she had forgotten the child was in the car. Prosecutors determined that Belle's negligence constituted criminal conduct. Leaving an 8-month-old infant in a hot car and going inside to take a nap was not a momentary lapse or an understandable mistake. It was reckless disregard for the child's safety. Belle was charged with second-degree murder and cruelty to children. The charges reflected the prosecution's determination that Belle's conduct had caused Jessica Tata's death and that her actions met the legal standard for criminal culpability. The trial focused on Belle's actions and her claim that she had forgotten the child. Prosecutors argued that Belle had been criminally negligent and that her decision to leave Jessica Tata in the car while she went inside to nap had directly caused the child's death. The defense could not dispute the facts. Belle had left the child in the car, the child had died, and Belle's explanation was that she had forgotten. The jury convicted Belle of second-degree murder and cruelty to children. LaToya Louise Bell was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The sentence reflected the jury's conclusion that Belle's negligence had caused Jessica Tata's death and that her conduct met the standard for criminal culpability. The judge made clear that leaving an 8-month-old infant in a hot car while going inside to take a nap was inexcusable. LaToya Louise Bell has likely completed or is nearing completion of her 10-year sentence. Jessica Tata's double was 8 months old when she died. She was a relative of the woman who was supposed to care for her. She was left in a car with the windows up in the Georgia heat while LaToya Bell went inside to take a nap. Bell claimed she forgot the child was there. Jessica Tata died because the adult responsible for her safety failed to ensure that she was removed from the vehicle. The case is another tragic reminder of how quickly children can die in hot cars and how such deaths are entirely preventable. Case 8. Kristi Shianne Hall. An infant named Caleb Wisnan Jr. was found unresponsive at the Narrowway Daycare in Huntsville, Alabama, in 2015. An autopsy revealed a lethal level of Benadryl in the child's system. Investigators determined that the child had been given the antihistamine, which is used to induce drowsiness, and that the dose had been fatal. Kristi Shianne Hall, a daycare worker at the facility, was charged with chemical endangerment of a child resulting in death, which is Alabama's version of felony murder in cases involving drugs or chemicals. She was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The case became notorious not only for the death of Caleb Wisnan Jr., but also for what it revealed about a disturbing trend: daycare workers using antihistamines to force children to nap. Kristi Shianne Hall was employed at Narroway Daycare and was responsible for the care of infants and young children. She was entrusted with the care of Caleb Wisnan Jr. and failed catastrophically in that responsibility by administering a lethal dose of Benadryl to the child. Caleb Wisnan Jr. was an infant. His exact age is not specified in all sources, but he was young enough to be in the infant room at the daycare. His parents had placed him at Narroway Daycare, believing he would be safe. Caleb Wisnan Jr. was found unresponsive at Narroway Daycare. Emergency responders were called, but the child could not be revived. An autopsy was performed to determine the cause of death. Toxicology results revealed a lethal level of Benadryl in Caleb's system. The presence of the antihistamine indicated that someone had administered the drug to the child, and that the dose had been high enough to cause death. Benadryl, which is sold over the counter as a treatment for allergies, is also known to cause drowsiness. In daycare settings, there have been documented cases of workers using Benadryl to force children to nap, a practice that is both dangerous and illegal. The autopsy results made clear that Caleb had not died of natural causes or an accident. He had been given a drug that killed him. The investigation focused on the staff at Narroway Daycare. Kristi Shianne Hall was identified as the worker responsible for Caleb's care at the time he became unresponsive. Investigators determined that Hall had administered the Benadryl to Caleb. The motive was not explicitly documented in all sources, but the use of Benadryl in daycare settings is typically associated with an attempt to sedate children to make them easier to manage. The practice is dangerous because the dosing of Benadryl for infants is difficult to determine, and because even small overdoses can be fatal. Hall was charged with chemical endangerment of a child resulting in death, a charge under Alabama law that applies when a person exposes a child to drugs or chemicals, and that exposure results in death. The charge is similar to felony murder in that it does not require proof of intent to kill, only proof that the underlying felony caused the death. The trial focused on the toxicology evidence and Hall's actions. Prosecutors argued that Hall had given Caleb Wisnan Jr. a lethal dose of Benadryl, and that her actions had directly caused his death. The toxicology results were clear. Caleb had a lethal level of Benadryl in his system, and Hall had been responsible for his care when the drug was administered. The jury convicted Kristi Shianne Hall of chemical endangerment of a child resulting in death. Kristi Shianne Hall was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The case also drew attention to a systemic issue: the use of antihistamines by daycare workers to sedate children. Prosecutors and child safety advocates noted that Caleb Wisnan Jr.'s case was not an isolated incident, and that there had been other reports of daycare workers using Benadryl and similar drugs to force children to nap. The practice is terrifying because it puts children at risk of overdose, and because it reflects a fundamental failure to understand the responsibilities of childcare. Kristi Shianne Hall serves 20 years in an Alabama prison. Caleb Wisnan Jr. was given a lethal dose of Benadryl by a daycare worker who was supposed to keep him safe. The case exposed a disturbing trend of workers using antihistamines to sedate children, a practice that is both dangerous and entirely preventable. Caleb's death was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate decision to administer a drug to a child, and that decision cost him his life. Case 9. Kimberly Duclos. Kimberly Duclos was a mother of 3 with a spotless record when 10-month-old Nathan Gauthier died in her care at her licensed family daycare in Quincy, Massachusetts, in 1993. Medical examiners determined that Nathan had died from quote, _3, 0, __. The community was shocked. Duclos had operated a licensed daycare with no complaints, no history of violence, and no indication she was anything other than a responsible caregiver. She was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The case became another entry in the contested and controversial history of shaken baby syndrome prosecutions. Kimberly Duclos had obtained the necessary state licensure to operate a daycare out of her home, which meant she had passed background checks and met regulatory requirements. She was a mother of 3 children herself. Those who knew her before the incident described her as having a spotless record. There was no indication that she had ever harmed a child, no complaints against her daycare, and no reason for parents to distrust her. She appeared to be exactly the kind of caregiver parents hope to find: experienced, licensed, and responsible. Nathan Gauthier was 10 months old. His parents had placed him at Duclos' licensed family daycare, trusting that he would be safe. Nathan was too young to speak, too young to defend himself, and incapable of protecting himself from violence. Nathan Gauthier died while in Kimberly Duclos' care. Medical examiners performed an autopsy and determined that the cause of death was __31, a term used to describe injuries caused by violent shaking combined with impact to the head. The diagnosis indicated that Nathan had been subjected to a significant amount of force, enough to cause fatal brain injuries. When investigators questioned Duclos, she did not provide a clear explanation for what had happened. The medical evidence became the foundation of the prosecution's case. There were no witnesses to what had happened in Duclos' home. There was no confession. The evidence was the injuries to Nathan's body and the medical expert's conclusion that those injuries could only have been caused by violent shaking and impact. The prosecution argued that Duclos had caused Nathan's death by shaking him, and that the medical evidence proved it. The medical testimony was persuasive, and the jury convicted Duclos of second-degree murder. Kimberly Duclos was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence reflected the jury's conclusion that she had caused Nathan Gauthier's death through an intentional act of violence. The community was shocked. Duclos had been a mother of 3 with no prior record. She had operated a licensed daycare with no complaints. How could she have killed an infant? The conviction suggested that even caregivers with spotless records and good reputations are capable of acts of violence under the right circumstances, or that the medical evidence of shaken baby syndrome was persuasive enough to overcome any doubts about Duclos' character. Kimberly Duclos became eligible for parole in 2008, 15 years after her conviction. It is likely that she has been paroled, though public records confirming her release are not readily available. Nathan Gauthier was 10 months old when he died in Kimberly Duclos' care. Medical examiners determined the cause was shaken impact syndrome. The case remains part of the controversial history of shaken baby syndrome prosecutions, in which medical evidence is often the sole basis for conviction, and in which the accused frequently maintain their innocence. Whether Duclos caused Nathan's death or whether the medical evidence was flawed is a question that has never been definitively resolved. What is certain is that Nathan Gauthier died in her care and that a jury concluded she was responsible. Case 10. Jessica Tata. Surveillance cameras at a Target store in Houston captured a young woman browsing the aisles on the afternoon of February 24, 2011. She moved without urgency through the store, selecting items, pausing to browse. A former Target manager would later testify that when the woman realized she had left a stove burner on at home with 7 children inside, she did not rush to leave. She continued shopping. At that same moment, 3 miles away, a pan of oil was igniting on that stove. 7 children, all under the age of 4, were alone in a house that was filling with smoke and flames. Neighbors would hear them crying as they tried unsuccessfully to rescue them. 4 of the children would die. 3 would survive with severe burns covering their bodies. The woman shopping at Target was Jessica Tata. the 22-year-old owner of Jackie's Childcare. She fled to Nigeria, was placed on the U.S. Marshals' 15 most wanted list, and was eventually convicted of felony murder and sentenced to 80 years in prison. Jessica Tata was born in 1988 in the United States and held dual citizenship with Nigeria. By the age of 14, she had already demonstrated a dangerous pattern. In 2002, as a freshman at Taylor High School in Katy, Texas, Tata started 2 fires in the girls' bathroom on the same day. Her brother Ron, a basketball star at the school, punched a trophy case when he learned his sister was responsible. Tata pleaded guilty to arson in juvenile court and served 3 years of probation. Lisa Hayes, a Houston Fire Department arson investigator who taught Tata a mandatory fire prevention class in 2003, would later testify that Tata had shown no remorse and quote _3, 2, ___. That conviction should have prevented Tata from ever obtaining a daycare license. In February 2010, when Tata applied to open Jackie's Childcare, she lied on the state application and concealed her juvenile arson record. The Texas Department of Family and Protective Services ran a background check, but the juvenile conviction did not appear. Susan Lohmeyer, a former district director of licensing, would later testify that if the state had known about the arson history, it would have prevented the agency from issuing a license. A teenage fire starter who did not care about hurting people was licensed to care for infants. She worked alone at the daycare most of the time. On February 24, 2011, 7 children were in Tata's care. 4 of them would not survive the day. Elias Castillo was 16 months old. His mother, Keisha Brown, described him as a happy baby who seemed to always be smiling. Shamari Leon Dickerson was 3 years old. His mother, Tiffany Dickerson, worked as a technician at West Houston Medical Center. Shamari's 2-year-old sister, Michaela, was also at the daycare that day. Elizabeth Koja was 20 months old. Kendall Stratford was 20 months old. 3 other children were there as well. Michaela Dickerson, DeJohn Ashley, who was 22 months old, and 1 other toddler. All of the children were under the age of 4. All of them depended completely on the person who was supposed to keep them safe. What happened that morning was not an accident. It was abandonment. Tata placed a pan of oil on the stove in her home on Crest Park, near Way Park Drive, in the A-Leaf section of Houston, and activated the burner. She then left the house and drove to a nearby Target store, leaving all 7 children alone and unsupervised. While she shopped, the pan of oil ignited. The house caught fire. Neighbors heard the children crying and attempted to rescue them, but the flames and smoke were too intense. By the time emergency responders arrived, 4 children were dead or dying, and 3 were severely burned. Tata returned home shortly before 1:30 in the afternoon to find her house engulfed in flames and toxic smoke. When investigators questioned her, Tata lied. She told them she had been at home when the fire began. Surveillance video from Target proved otherwise. The cameras had captured her shopping at the store during the fire. A former Target manager testified that after Tata realized she had left the stove burner on, she did not appear to be in a hurry to leave. She continued browsing. She never seemed rushed or panicked. Prosecutors would later present evidence that this was not the first time Tata had left children alone. There had been a pattern of abandonment. It was only a matter of time before her actions led to tragedy. The investigation began immediately. The evidence against Tata mounted quickly. But before prosecutors could charge her, she was gone. On February 26, 2011, 2 days after the fire, Tata caught a flight to Nigeria. She had not been charged at the time she left the country. On February 28th, prosecutors filed charges. 1 count of reckless bodily injury to a child with a bond set at $500,000. But Tata was already hiding in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, where her father lived. The charges were soon upgraded to 4 counts of murder, 6 counts of reckless injury to a child, 3 counts of child abandonment, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Tata was placed on the U.S. Marshals' 15 Most Wanted Fugitives list. A $25,000 reward was offered for information leading to her capture. She remained in Nigeria for nearly a month. On March 19, 2011, she surrendered to U.S. Embassy officials. Locals had tipped off authorities, drawn by the reward money. On March 21, 2011, Tata was returned to the United States in custody. She was jailed and remained incarcerated continuously from that day forward. Prosecutors Steve Baldessano and Connie Spence would handle the case. Her defense attorney was Mike DeJurin. Prosecutors decided to try Tata only for the murder of Elias Castillo, the youngest victim. The trial began on October 24, 2012, in Harris County Criminal Courthouse in Houston. It lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution built its case on Texas's felony murder law, which allows a conviction if an underlying felony leads to a death. The state did not need to prove that Tata intended to kill the children. It only needed to prove that her act of abandoning them caused their deaths. Baldessano presented 30 witnesses. Neighbors testified about hearing the children crying during their unsuccessful rescue attempts. Parents of the dead and injured children testified about the trust they had placed in Tata. The former target manager described her lack of urgency. Lisa Hayes, the fire prevention instructor from Tata's 2003 arson case, testified about Tata's attitude toward hurting people. Susan Lohmeyer explained how Tata's lie on the Daycare application had allowed a convicted arsonist to obtain a license. The surveillance video was shown repeatedly to the jury. She doesn't seem to care at all she left those kids home alone, Baldessano told the jury. She's just hanging out, going to Target. The prosecution sought a life sentence. The defense argued that the deaths were a tragic accident, not murder. DeGurin claimed the fire might have been caused by an electrical malfunction in the refrigerator or stove. Prosecutors called the refrigerator theory crazy. DeGurin acknowledged that Tata should never have left the children alone, but argued that she had never intended to harm them. What it's not is murder, he said. Tata did not testify. On November 13, 2012, the jury convicted her of felony murder. Each juror was polled. All of them found that Tata had used a deadly weapon, fire. The punishment phase of the trial lasted 5 days. 22 prosecution witnesses testified. Then the jury deliberated for 8 hours. On November 20th, 2012, they sentenced Jessica Tata to 80 years in prison and ordered her to pay a $10,000 fine. Victim impact testimony filled the courtroom. Keisha Brown, Elias Castillo's mother, cried as she described her son as a happy baby. One juror was seen crying as she testified. Tiffany Dickerson and the other mothers held hands and wept. The jury was shown photographs of the burns suffered by the survivors. DeJohn Ashley had been burned on 22% of his body, and Michaela Dickerson on 15%. Both children had undergone multiple surgeries. Tiffany Dickerson later described the moment she saw her daughter in the hospital. Quote 38. Elias Castillo's grandmother, Rosie Castillo, told the court, "She deserves life in prison so she doesn't do any more harm." Prosecutor Connie Spence reminded the jury that Tata had made her own life the priority, not the children's. Quote 40. She asked. Tata was silent as the sentence was read. She declined the opportunity to speak. Her defense attorney, Mike DeGurin, said afterward, Quote 41. After sentencing, the judge dropped the remaining 8 cases against Tata so that she could begin serving her sentence immediately. The district attorney retained the option to refile the murder charges for the other 3 children at a later time. On January 28, 2013, Tata was transferred from the Harris County Jail to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Jessica Tata is 37 years old. She is incarcerated at the Patrick L. O'Daniel Unit in Texas, where she must serve 30 years before becoming eligible for parole in 2041. Her maximum sentence date is 2091. The lie she told on her daycare application was never caught by the background check system. A teenage fire starter who said she didn't care about hurting people was licensed to care for infants. And the systemic failure that allowed it came too late to save Elias Castillo, Shomari Dickerson, Elizabeth Koja, and Kendall Stradford. 4 children died because she chose to go shopping at Target. 3 survivors carry scars, both physical and psychological. Michaela Dickerson, who was rushed to Shriners Hospital in Galveston with burns covering 15% of her body, calls herself a miracle baby. Neighbors still remember hearing the children crying. Surveillance cameras captured Jessica Tata shopping, while 7 toddlers faced flames alone. She did not rush. She did not panic. She continued browsing the aisles at Target while the house burned,